Hello FlossTube and welcome back. This is part 9 of my celebration of colour series. I'm Ros Clark. This is Ros Clark Craft here on YouTube, and you'll find me as Ros Clark Craft also on Instagram and Etsy. So like I say, this is part 9. That means we are 3/4 of the way through our stitch along, and obviously way more than 3/4 of the way through the actual stitching. So this is mine. This is my second stitch through with these slightly different, more muted, slightly more brownish tone colours. That's actually a really good representation of the colour. It's maybe a bit dull. Excuse me. I am at the end of what was a really horrid cold earlier this week. I'm a little bit sneezy and coughy today. I will try and edit out as much of the unpleasantness as I can. So that's where we're up to. That is blue-green. I have to admit, I did have to keep checking that really was my blue-green because it felt quite bluish. And I don't know if you've noticed that as you're stitching through and you're sort of comparing this colour to the previous one, I'm like, it looks really blue. And then I have to get out my actual blue choice and I'm like, oh no, it is blue-green. The next one is really blue. But because you're stitching next to a colour that's going in the different direction on the colour wheel, it's easy to feel like you've gone further round than you actually have. So you can see we've just got 1/4 of the way left on our colour wheel here. We're filling in some of our other parts that you can predict at this point. We finally filled in something in our last little empty square. And we are getting there. We are really getting there. I'm really enjoying how this one is coming together. It looks very different from my first one. Put a picture there with the sort of really bright colours on the white background. This one is much more muted. You're starting to see how colours are blending together. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in today's video. So the sections where there's the checkerboards. So you've got, I think these are the ones that somebody has described as socks knitted by someone who can't do feet. I think she's talking about those parts. But also in this kind of black outline section where we've done some of these checkerboards and you're sort of blending colours together. And it's a really interesting test for how well you chose your colour wheel. Some of mine really blend in together. Like this one, it's 2 different colours, but it really blends into one. This one as well. Others, you can see much more distinction, like here, for example. I think that is yellow and yellow-green. Oh, that's right. And I had to change my yellow, you remember, because I ran out of thread. So it doesn't blend in nearly as well as it might have done. And, you know, some of them, like this square in the bottom left, where it's blending across 3 different colours, and you can sort of see how it moves across. And that sort of checkerboard pattern is one that I quite often like to use in my designs as a way of merging from one colour to another. Rather than just trying to choose lots of individual different colours of floss that are quite close to each other, actually to merge them in by doing those sort of checkerboard styles. You'll also see it's not quite so much for the merging in on my medieval design, the elephantine one in particular. Yeah, I like to use that sort of checkerboard as a way of mixing colours. Excuse me. So hopefully you're making good progress on this. I think it's a while since we've had a chart with a mistake. It is a lot easier, obviously, at this point. Somebody did get in touch relatively recently, say, have you missed out a section here? Or have you missed that section? No, I haven't. But do check if you're not sure. It's always absolutely fine to get in touch and check. But anyway, after this is blue-green, and then we'll just have blue, purple, and we'll finish up with purple in just a few weeks' time. It's very exciting. Just to let you know, I don't know why you need to know this, but this is what is happening. I am away for a couple of weekends at the end of March, the last 2 weeks of the stitch along. So I'm going to be stitching and filming all of the final videos this weekend and next weekend. So I'm going to do blue-green today, blue tomorrow, and then the final 2 next weekend. Therefore, if you have any questions, if you have any things particularly questions about colour, but about the stitch along as well, if you'd like, anything that you think, oh, I really was hoping she was going to talk about that in this series, or anything that's come up, do leave a comment on this video. That will be your best chance of getting it answered in one of the videos in this series. I mean, if I don't get to it in time, I might try and answer it in a normal floss tube or whatever. But it'd be nice to have all the colour things together. So if you've got any questions about colour theory, colour substitution, how to choose colours, what colours work well together. I haven't really talked about cool colours and warm colours. Maybe that's a thing that you sort of know about but not really sure about. How do you, I don't know, whatever your questions are, do feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll try and get to them in one of the final videos. What I am going to do also in the last, probably in the last video, maybe in the 2 final videos, is I'm going to talk to you about some finishing ideas, because, I mean, obviously you could frame it and it would look fabulous. It might not be the thing you want like on display in your sitting room. If you've got a sewing room or a craft room, something like that, it's a really great kind of colour reference to have. You've got your colour wheel and you've got lots of examples of how the colours work together. If you want to know which colours are complementary, you've got this little ladder section, colours and as they blend together. So, I mean, it'd be a great thing to frame in that sort of situation. But I do have a couple of other finishing ideas that I will share with you in one of the last videos. I think probably the last video. So that is part 9, blue-green. What I wanted to talk to you about this time is variegated floss. Lots of great comments about last week's video, particularly the importance of background fabric and the impact that that can have on colours. And so do just be bearing that in mind, really. It is, unless you only ever stitch on sort of a Zweigart or a Witchold or something like that, that's a really standard factory-based colour, you are always going to have to consider your background fabric. Even if you always stitch on the called for dye lots from hand dyers won't be the same always. And even if it is the same, if you've got something with any sort of mottling variation to it, you might be working on a different part of the fabric that actually has more of the darker colour or more of the lighter colour or more mixing or whatever. So it's just a thing always to bear in mind. You can do the classic floss toss, but bear in mind what we were talking about last time, that colours in the skein in a sort of big solid block look very different to colours once they're stitched, particularly if you're stitching with a less dense coverage, and particularly if you're stitching kind of individual stitches here and there rather than in big blocks on your fabric. So yeah, and it's your stitching. If you're not happy with how the colours are looking, how they're working, then you get to decide if you want to change them. Right, flosses. So again, variegated flosses, we're mostly talking about hand dyed, although you can get variegated DMC, and I guess, although I haven't been and checked, other sort of manufactured floss may also have those sort of variegated options as well. There is a slight difference between a variegated DMC and a variegated floss from a hand dye, and that's that the manufactured kind will tend to come in very regular sections, a specific length before the colour change. And that's okay. It's just worth knowing, so that if, for example, you're stitching a block of something and it turns out the colour changes exactly the length of the stitching you need for that block, you perhaps don't want to just do it in rows unless you're really looking for a striped effect. And actually I'll talk about that in some of the examples I've got as well, because you can get something a bit similar with hand dyed floss. So just be aware that you might need to manually work out where to put the colours if you want to avoid that sort of fixed striping look. I used to do a lot of knitting, and one of the things that people found there, either with manufactured, or even to some extent with hand-dyed yarn, you would get a thing called pooling. And that is where the sort of length of the repeat and the length of your row that you were stitching, not were identical, because then you would just get striping, but that they had a sort of factor amount, or they were sort of shifting by a certain amount, and you would just end up with sort of big pools of one of the colours rather than a sort of evenly spread speckle effect, which is what you might be looking for. You could manipulate it deliberately to use that, and there was a whole Ravelry group on something called planned pooling, and you could get some extraordinary effects if you worked out the length of the repeat, compared it with the length of your row, and you can end up with sort of almost argyle diamond shapes. I'll see if I can find some photos and show you, because you can get a really extraordinary effects with planned pooling. All of that just knitted from a single ball of yarn. You're not changing colours, and you're ending up with sort of glorious effects. I guess you could do something like that in cross stitch, but you would have to do, I think, all of the maths yourself, because everybody would have a slightly different stitch length that they're using depending how they're carrying their floss, and you know, it would be quite precise, I think. So you could certainly do it, but I think you would have to work out your own sample and stitch pattern and then have a go at that. But more often, I think, when we're using variegated floss, we're not aiming for a geometric pattern. We're not aiming for a regular repeat. We're wanting something that's a bit more organic than that. And so if you are using something like the DMC variegated, you just need to perhaps be aware that you might need to do some manual manipulation of where you're placing your stitches in order to make it more random, because it won't necessarily naturally have a randomness to it. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about regular manufactured. Normally when we're talking about variegated, we're talking about hand dyed, and there are various kinds of ways that we might need to think about it. Now I've got this floss, I've got various flosses to show you, and I picked up this one, and now I don't know if it has the effect that I wanted it to illustrate. I don't think it does. I can't find the first example I was going to show you. It's from I think she's a UK-based dyer. I don't know if she's still in business. I haven't bought from her for a while, and I don't really plan to buy from her again, and so I'm not going to tell you who I'm talking about. And I bought some hand-dyed floss, and it was not brilliantly dyed, so that there were, and you couldn't really see it from the outside of the skein, it was just that where it had been dyed, it hadn't all gone through all of the strands of floss, so that there were effectively white flecks and little sections in it. It wasn't great, and you know, I might even have been tempted to send it back, but I'm not that organised. If you've got a floss like that, and particularly if you don't discover it until, you know, if you bought your floss and then haven't used it for years, and then suddenly you pick it up and you're like, oh, okay, this isn't really what I wanted. But you do want to be able to use it. I would say you need to be able to, and we'll come on to some examples of this, you need to be able to use your floss in a way that minimises the variegation. So often when people are giving advice about how to use variegated thread, it's advice on how to maximize the variegation, how to really highlight that in your stitching. But there are times, I think there's all sorts of times, but that would certainly be one example. If you've got a not brilliantly well dyed thread, if you want to minimize the variation on that, we'll talk about ways that you might do that. All hand-dyed thread to some extent is going to be variegated. So I've got some examples here of different kinds of variegation. And again, in the knitting world, often these have different descriptors, because, you know, people are buying their yarn online, just as we're often buying our floss online, and we're not able to choose it. So this is Gentle Art Hibiscus. I would say this is a tonal variegated. It's a really pretty pink. Oh, I don't know how much of that you can see, as usual. It's quite difficult. I'd be really glad when I stop having to try and get my phone to show colours. But it's all clearly within the same colour family. but there are slight bits that are lighter and bits that are darker. Okay, this is a bit lighter on this side and it's a bit darker on that side. It was perfect for, you know, stitching things that have a natural slight variegation to them, like a flower, like things in nature. But also you might want to stitch it for something that's not natural, so, you know, a house or a dress or something like that. And you think, it's not that I want shading within that, it's just that I want the depth of colour I get from something that's not just a flat solid. So you might want to highlight the shading, you might want to be able to, again, manipulate that and think, I'm going to put the bits where I can see I'm at a darker part of the floss, I don't know, nearer the edge of the flower or nearer the centre of the flower, and the paler bits the other side, and that will give me some natural sort of shading. Or you might say, well, I don't really mind where it comes, but I just like that there's some variegation to the colour and some depth, and I want to highlight that. And in other cases, you might say, no, I just want it to all look the same. You know, my eye to perceive it all as the same, but with a bit more depth and richness than if I just used a straightforward DMC. So that's what I would call, I don't know, I'm going to try it against my hand and see if that's any better. Yeah, I think you can see that. A tonal variegated. So we've got a badly dyed, which I haven't got the example of to show you after all. We've got a tonal variegated. Okay, where have I put the next ones? This one, so this is Roxy Floss Lucille. It's one of their lovely reds. It actually looks a bit more variegated there, but I think it's just the sort of light shadows. I would describe this one as a semi-solid. So I wouldn't quite describe it as a solid because it's not factory made like a DMC. But as I am looking at it, the variegation is so subtle. I mean, that really does look a lot more variegated than it is in real life because it's got a big shadow across it. Let's try that again. It's really subtle. So it's not quite solid, but I would describe it as a semi-solid. It's the sort of nearest you can get to a solid using a hand dye technique. Much less variegated than the hibiscus. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, what might be a useful thing at this point, if you've got fancy flossers at home, is to pick out something. There you can see that sort of lighter streak of pink. That's definitely showing. You can definitely see there's more variegation in that than in the Lucille. So tonal variegated, semi-solid, badly dyed. Then you get to something like this. Now this is also Roxy Floss Co. This is Pom Poms. It was in the holiday countdown box. I don't know if it's now part of their regular line. It's also a tonal variegated, but it's much more obviously variegated. I've been using quite a lot of this, not that much left. But you can see there's some really pale and really dark and sort of medium. And it's all in the same sort of slightly bluish, sort of spruce greens. Let me see if I can show you a little bit more of that, like that. Okay, so that's all pom-poms. So that is strongly variegated, but it is still tonal variegated, all within the same part of the colour wheel. Okay, in fact, everything we've looked at so far is tonal variegated. And then you get to something like this. Okay, this is a cottage garden thread. I've lost the label, so I don't know which one it is, but it's got, you can see a sort of lime green, a sort of greyish purple, and a rusty red, and then a sort of yellowy bit where they go between each other. Those are not in the same part of the colour wheel. Okay, that is a wildly variegated, is what I would say. It's certainly not a tonal variegated, it is a wildly variegated. And obviously you can have all sorts of things in between. You could have something which is much more subtle. They could all be greyish tones, or all very pastel tones, or all very jewel tones, but just slightly moving around the colour wheel. So a pink and a yellow, or a pink and a yellow and a green, but just, you know, a little bit of variation within a colour, within the same tone. So what do? If you pick up a wildly variegated skein like this and you think that's fabulous, I'd like my stitching to look like that, how do you make sure that it is? Well, it slightly depends what you're stitching, but there also depends ways of stitching it. So I want to show you some examples. So I stitched my first set of examples with this. This is another Cottage Garden thread. This is Bushfire Moon, and this one has got beautiful deep red, a bright orange, and then a slightly sort of murky olivey green. How do you stitch with that? So my first sample is this one. So this is stitched with 2 strands of floss, and I've stitched full cross stitches in rows, and what I've ended up with is stripes. And actually I'm looking at this, and other than the sort of very beginning and end stitches of each row where you've got the bit where the floss is changing colour, you almost would believe that I just stitched that using 3 entirely different flosses. Now that might be the effect that you want. You might be looking for something that looks like I've stitched 3 entirely different flosses but without the faff of actually changing flosses. Great. You might be looking for something stripy. Great. You might not be. You might not be. You might have picked this floss and thought, oh, that's amazing. I look at this floss and I think that's amazing autumn foliage, which isn't usually stripy. So how are we going to make it less stripy? So the next sample I did, this is still stitched with 2 strands of floss, but instead of taking the 2 strands of floss from the same length, I took them and I switched one of them around, so that we're not getting the orange matching with the orange, the red matching with the red, the green matching with the green. We're getting 2 colours, almost like a blended floss. Some places they'll overlap, but more often they won't. And again, I've stitched this in full cross stitches. So you can see I've already muted the variegation. You can definitely see in this one, there's a lot of colour going on, but it's not nearly as rigid. It's not as striped. It's almost like someone's kind of blurred the stripe doing it like that. And then I've taken it one step further, and I've still taken this time my 2 strands not lined up, but this time instead of doing full crosses, I've done a whole row of the bottom leg, and I've come back and then done my top leg. And what that means, if I'm doing a full cross, generally within the length of a cross stitch, I'm most likely to get the same colour on the top and the bottom. But if I'm doing all of my bottom legs and then coming back on my top legs, I'm likely to get different on the top and the bottom. And given that I'm also likely to have 2 different strands in each part of the stitch, that's up to 4 different colours, 4 different parts of my variegated floss that are going to come together. And so I can certainly see this one is even more blurry. Now, I don't think the stitches look as great, and if you were looking up close, you'd be like, oh, that looks really messy. But if you were looking at more of a distance, you definitely get much more of an impressionist look, much more blurry, even than this middle one, and obviously than the striped one. Now, depending what you're stitching, any one of these might be what you are aiming for. If you were stitching something that had like little leaves, I would go for this one. And then each leaf could be a different colour, or maybe one colour shading into the next, but you'd get a really nice selection of sort of autumn leaves just doing it like this. If you had something that was a little bit further in the background, maybe it's a sort of a whole tree rather than individual little leaves, this might work quite well, and you kind of get the impression of it all being there, and you get, you know, some areas of the tree would be a bit greener and some a bit oranger and some a bit redder, but not leaf by leaf. This one, if it's right in the distance, and all I want is a sort of vague impression of autumn foliage, but I don't want anyone to feel like they can pick out any form, I might use it like that. Did you see? It's not that this is right and this is wrong. This one is just highlighting the variegation, and this one is muting the variegation. And in different places, each one of those might be the best thing to use. Now, the other thing to notice on this, let's just think about where all these colours come on the colour wheel. You've got this, which is very much in the red section. Let's try it on a background again. The orange, so that's including more yellow. And then we've got, and then we throw it on the floor. And then we've got the green. And I know a number of you noticed, once we started getting to the yellow, green and the green on our stitch along, it started to change. It started to feel like we'd moved into a different part. And that's because we're now reaching colours which are opposite each other on the colour wheel. And if you are mixing together colours which are opposite each other on the colour wheel, you're going to tend towards brown. So we've got a sort of reddish orange, really deep reddish orange, a really bright, vibrant orange. So those are nice together. But then we've got a green that's over here somewhere. And we're going to mix those together and we're going to tend towards brown. That's what would happen with paint, but it is also what is happening as we are making our variegation mix together more and more. So we're keeping the colours very separate and vibrant, or we're mixing them together and we're getting them very brownish and blurred. So that's again a thing to consider when you're using a variegated floss that is not tonal. It's not within the same place on the colour wheel. What colours on the wheel are there? How do they relate to each other? If they're close to each other, they'll tend to help each other become more intense, or together they'll produce something more intense. So mixing a pink and an orange is one of my favourite things to do. A reddish pink rather than a bluish one, and a reddish orange, and you get a sort of a red effect but really vibrant. I really love it. You know, mixing a yellow and a green together, and you can end up with a really fabulous kind of limey colour. But if you were to mix a green and a purple, you don't get vibrant, you get mud. And that can be what you want. It can tone down. Great. And you still get, you know, you can still see, even in our most variegated one, the different little bits. It's a much more interesting thing than if we just picked a brown tone, because you've got little bits of the green and the red and the orange coming together. But depending where it is and how far away you're looking at it from, your eye might just process that as a rich, interesting brown, rather than all of those individual colours. And the same thing happens when we use a tonal thread, but we don't get the danger of muddy colour. So I've used the pom-pom on this, and again, well, I've done a slightly different thing with this. So I've started off with 2 strands of the same length, full cross, but instead of stitching in rows, I have tried to stitch randomly so that I am sort of putting the darker stitches and the lighter stitches in their own spaces. It ended up not having as much dark in the length of thread that I'd chosen as I thought, so it's slightly less obvious. So that's that. And then similarly here, I've used 2 strands but not lining up, swapping them, you know, flipping one round. And again, I've tried to stitch deliberately randomly. And then here, again, deliberately randomly, but I did all the bottom legs and then all the top legs. And I think you can still see an increasing blur going across, although by stitching randomly, I've certainly avoided any kind of stripes or geometry. So what is all that to say? Well, if I was starting with my very badly dyed floss with white flecks, I absolutely would not want to stitch it like this. I would certainly, if I were using 2 strands, flip one round. So where there were white flecks, it was likely to only be on one part of the floss and not both. Obviously, if you're stitching 1/2 or 1/1, you don't have the option to do that. But if you're stitching with 2 strands of floss, you can mute the variegation by not using 2 identical strands. And if I had a floss where I was trying to avoid a particular part, whether that was white flecks that weren't dyed, or if it had a particularly unpleasant colour where 2 of the colours were sort of going from one to another, or, you know, a bit that I thought, I'm not sure that really fits in exactly where I want. I would definitely flip the colour so that at best you've got one strand with that and it will be muted by the other colour that it's with. And in that, so that's if there's a problem with the floss itself. If I've got a tonal variegated, I would need to decide, do I want to heighten that contrast, or am I actually happy, you know, I want the effect of something that's sort of solid but just has a little bit more interest to it. And with the tonal variegated, you can effectively make it more of a semi-solid. With a semi-solid, it's probably not going to make that much difference, but I would still probably avoid this unless I was happy that I would going to get a stripy effect. Some people like a stripy effect on a dress or a house or whatever. I don't love it, so I tend to try and avoid that stripiness either by this, where I'm using 2 different strands, or by something more like this, just not stitching in rows. If I've got a tonal variegated that's wildly variegated, again, I want to think, do I really want to make the most of the variegation and highlight that, get myself some really deep shadows and highlights, in which case 2 strands that are identical, stitching full crosses, stitching in some kind of order, it doesn't necessarily have to be stripes, you could do it in a cross and a diagonal, something like that. Or do I want to minimize that? I want something that's a color with depth, but I really want, you know, it to be sort of uniform across the whole stitching area. Okay, well, in that case, 2 separate strands. I might stitch all the bottom legs then, all the top legs. I certainly won't stitch it in rows. So it's not, I think, that there are hard and fast rules about variegated floss, which, you know, I have heard people say you must do this, you mustn't do that. No, it's your floss and it's your stitching. You decide what do you want to achieve, and therefore how are you going to use the floss to accomplish that. Do I want a sort of muted, muddier look? Do I want a very vibrant, very distinct colours? Do I want that differently? Something that's in the foreground of my piece and something that's in the background of my piece. This sort of look where you've got the colours really, really distinct, I like that best if I'm doing something like lettering, where it's not trying to capture a natural form, where I'm stitching a line rather than a block, or like if it's little sort of dots or something in the background and I want to make the most of that, or little individual stitches for flowers, I would absolutely do that, full cross and identical strands. But often that's not what you're stitching, and therefore that might not be the look that you want. So variegated floss, it's another way of thinking about how colour works on our stitching. Thanks so much for watching. I will be back next time with blue, and I can't remember what I'm going to be talking about. See you then.